frightened, not knowing. He sank to his knees by the stone wall, and looked up and opened his mouth to speak, but instead caught his breath sharply. A great flow of crimson and gold was spilling across the sky like lava, running molten from west to east. He watched, awestruck, as the pyre consumed the blue haze of the firmament and bathed the heavens with a glory that shook and moved him to his very depths. "Please," he whispered. It was then that he felt a sensation of warmth welling in him, a kind of liquid infilling he'd never experienced before. Something in his soul lifted up, as startling as a covey of quail breaking from the underbrush, and his heart acknowledged, suddenly and finally, that his love for her could not, would not be extinguished. He knew at last that no amount of effort, no amount of pleading with God would enable him to sustain any longer the desperate, wounding battle he had launched against loving her. In a way he couldn't explain, and in the space of the merest instant, he knew he'd come fully awake for the first time in his life. He also knew that he wanted nothing more than to be with her, at her side, and that after all the wasted months, he couldn't afford to waste another moment. But what if he'd waited too long, come to his senses too late? He sprang to his feet, as relieved as if he'd shaken off an approaching illness. Then, animated by a power not his own, he found himself running. "There comes a time," his cousin Walter had said, "when there's no turning back." He felt the motion of his legs and the breeze on his skin and the hammering in his temples, as if he might somehow implode, all of it combusting into a sharp inner flame, a durable fire, 1,000 hosannas. Streaming with sweat, he raced down Old Church Lane and into the cool green enclosure of Baxter Park, his body as weightless as a glider borne on wings of ether, though his heart was heavy with dread. She could have gone away as she'd done before, and this time she might never come back. The dark silhouette of the hedge separating the park from Cynthia's house and the rectory appeared far away. Another country, a landmark he might never reach. As he drew closer, he saw that her house was dark, but his own was aglow with light in every window, as if some wonderful thing might be happening. He bounded through the hedge. She was standing on his stoop. She held the door open, and the light from the kitchen gleamed behind her. She stood there as if she'd known the very moment he turned into the park, and, sensing the urgency of his heart, felt her own compelled to greet it. He ran up the steps, his chest heaving, as she stepped back and smiled at him. "Happy birthday," she said. "I love you, Cynthia." His lungs seemed to force the declaration onto the night air as if by their own will. He stood with his mouth open, marveling, while she raised her hand to her cheek in a way that made her appear dubious somehow, or amused. Did she think him mad? He felt mad, riotous. He wanted to climb on the roof, baying and whooping, a 60-something bachelor priest, mad with love for his next-door neighbor. He didn't consider the consequences of this wild skidding out of control. It was now or never. As she backed into the kitchen, he followed. He saw the cake on the breakfast table and the card propped against a vase of flowers, and he fell to one knee beside the table and gathered her hands in his. "Will you?" he croaked, looking up at her. "Will I what, dearest?" "You know." "No, I don't know." He knew that she knew. Why wouldn't she help him with this thing? He was perfectly willing to bring the other knee down if only she would help him. And why was he crouching here on the linoleum, sweating like a prize-fighter, when he might have been dressed in his best suit and doing this in the study or in the Lord's Chapel garden by the French roses? He tried to scramble to his feet and run upstairs, where he would take a shower and brush his teeth and get dressed and do this the right way. But his strength failed, and he found he couldn't move. He might have been glued to the linoleum, one knee up and one knee down, frozen as a herring. "Hurry, Timothy," she said, whispering. "Will you marry me?" "Yes! 1,000 times, yes!" She was helping him to his feet, and then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back. She drew away and looked at him with a kind of awe. He found her radiance dumbfounding. "I thought you'd never ask," she said. It was done. He had jumped over the barbed wire. He buried his face in her hair and held her close and bawled like a baby. He was a muddle of happiness and confusion, as if his brain had been stirred like so much porridge. He was unable to think straight or put one thought logically after another. He felt the magnitude of the thing he'd done, and knew he should do something to carry through, though he wasn't sure what. They had sat on his sofa, talking until 3 o'clock, but not once had they mentioned what they would do today. They had talked only about how they felt, and how mindlessly happy and grateful they were that this astonishing benediction should come to them, as a wild bird might come to their outstretched palms. "To have and to hold," she had murmured. "Till death do us part," he had said, nuzzling her hair. And no organizing of church suppers or ironing of fair linens, and positively nothing to do with the annual bane and blessing. "Right," he said. "Ever," she said. He hadn't a single rule or regulation to foist upon her. He was chopped liver. He was cooked spaghetti. He was dragged into the undertow of the great tsunami of love he'd so long held back. They had prayed together at last, and fallen asleep on the sofa, her head on his shoulder, his head against hers, bookends, then waked at 5 and scrambled to the back door, where Cynthia kissed him and darted through the hedge, devoutly hoping not to be seen. He'd bounded up the stairs to his room with a vigor that amazed him, murmuring aloud a quote from Wordsworth. "Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." Bliss, yes, as if he'd suddenly become lighter than air, as if the stone were at last rolled away from the tomb. He thought he might spring upward like a jack-in-the-box. Was any of this familiar to him? Had he ever felt it before? Never. Nothing in his supposed love for Peggy Kramer all those years ago had prepared him for this. In a misting summer rain, he headed for the church office at 9 o'clock, with Barnabas on the red leash. He should tell Emma, he supposed, who had served him faithfully for nearly 15 years. And Puny, the best house help a man could ever have, Puny would want to know. He could see them both, Emma wincing and frowning, then socking him on the arm with approval, and Puny, she would jump up and down and hoot and shout, and great tears would stream down her freckled cheeks. Then she'd go at once and bake a cake of cornbread, from which he, due to his blasted diabetes, might have one unbuttered, albeit large, slice. Aha, and there was Miss Sadie, of course. Wouldn't her eyes sparkle and gleam, and wouldn't she hug his neck for a fare-thee-well? And wouldn't Louella break out a coconut cake, or a chess pie, and wouldn't they have a party right there in the kitchen at Fernbank? On the other hand, wasn't Cynthia supposed to be along when he broke the news to anybody? He sighed. He was in the very business of life's milestones, including the occasional overseeing of engagements, yet he seemed to have forgotten everything he ever knew, if indeed he ever knew anything. Besides, he wasn't sure he was up for hooting and hollering and being punched in the arm, or any of the other stuff that usually came with such tidings. Then there was J.C., and Mule, and Percy. Good Lord, he dreaded that encounter like a toothache. All that back-slapping and winking and cackling,